A non-reflective termination resistor is a resistor installed at the termination of a transmission line to prevent wave reflection. When a wave reaches a point on the transmission line where the impedance differs, a portion of it gets reflected. Reflection creates a composite wave of forward-going and reflected waves, causing signal distortion and making communication difficult. To mitigate this, a non-reflective termination resistor is installed at the line's termination to eliminate reflection. To install a non-reflective termination resistor, a resistor with the same impedance as the characteristic impedance of the transmission line must be used. The characteristic impedance of a transmission line is determined by factors such as the material, structure, and frequency. Typically, the characteristic impedance of a coaxial cable is 50 ohms, so a 50 ohms non-reflective termination resistor is installed at the cable's termination. The characteristics of a non-reflective termination resistor are as follows. Impedance matches the characteristic impedance of the transmission line. Voltage standing wave ratio, VSWR, is equal to or less than 1. Power handling, determined based on the requirements of the communication system. VSWR represents the ratio of the amplitude of the reflected wave to the amplitude of the forward wave. When VSWR is less than 1, the amplitude of the reflected wave is smaller than the amplitude of the forward wave, effectively preventing reflections. A non-reflective termination resistor is essential in communication systems. Without it, signal loss and deterioration of communication quality can occur due to wave reflections. Here is the translated text. A non-reflective termination resistor is a resistor installed at the termination of a transmission line to prevent reflections in the line. As waves propagate along the transmission line and get reflected at the termination, a combination of forward-going waves and reflected waves causes signal distortion, making communication difficult. Installing a non-reflective termination resistor either completely or partially prevents these reflections. The principle of a non-reflective termination resistor is that it matches the impedance of the transmission line, thereby entirely preventing reflections. For instance, if the characteristic impedance of the transmission line is 50 ohms, the impedance of the non-reflective termination resistor should also be 50 ohms. Voltage standing wave ratio, VSWR, is a performance indicator for a non-reflective termination resistor. When VSWR is less than 1, reflections are entirely prevented, whereas if VSWR is greater than 1, reflections are only partially prevented. VSWR values of 1.5 or less minimize signal loss by nearly preventing reflections. Non-reflective termination resistors find applications in various fields such as communication, broadcasting, and electronic equipment. Particularly, they play a crucial role in improving signal quality by preventing reflections at the termination of transmission lines. Types of non-reflective termination resistors. Non-reflective termination resistors can be classified into the following types. 1. Resistor type non-reflective termination resistors. This is the most common type, adjusting the impedance of the resistor to match the characteristic impedance. 2. Capacitor type non-reflective termination resistors. Instead of a resistor, capacitors are used to prevent reflections by adjusting the capacitance to match the characteristic impedance. 3. Inductor type non-reflective termination resistors. These resistors use inductors to prevent reflections by adjusting the inductance to match the characteristic impedance. Installation of non-reflective termination resistors. Non-reflective termination resistors are connected at the termination point of a transmission line. Typically, they are connected using soldering or compression methods. When installing these resistors, it's crucial to verify the characteristic impedance of the transmission line and select a resistor with the matching impedance. Maintenance of non-reflective termination resistors. Non-reflective termination resistors generally do not require regular maintenance. However, periodic inspection is recommended due to the possibility of contamination or damage caused by environmental factors. If needed, replacement should be performed based on inspection results.